When the jury members saw the black man in the defendant's seat, they had already decided he was guilty. They had no idea that man was the famous heart surgeon Dr. Williams, who had saved 500 children's lives. But let's go back to the beginning. The Superior Court of Cook County buzzed with the usual morning energy as case number 2024-CR4751 was called to session. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over courtroom 302, a wood-paneled chamber where justice was supposed to be blind, but too often proved to have perfect vision when it came to seeing color, class, and social status. Dr. Marcus Williams sat in the defendant's chair wearing an Orange County Jail jumpsuit that had seen better days. At 42 years old, he was a distinguished man whose calm demeanor and intelligent eyes suggested depths that the courtroom's fluorescent lighting couldn't quite capture. His hair showed touches of gray at the temples, and his hands, surgeon's hands that had performed miracles, were now cuffed behind his back. The charges against him were serious: aggravated assault and battery, stemming from an incident outside Children's Memorial Hospital 3 weeks prior. According to the police report, Dr. Williams had violently attacked a white man in the hospital parking lot, sending him to the emergency room with a broken nose and concussion. What the report didn't mention was the context that had led to that confrontation. What it didn't capture was the 15 years Dr. Williams had spent dedicating his life to saving children others had given up on. And what it certainly didn't reflect was that this was a man who had never raised his hand in anger before in his entire life. The 12 jury members filed into their seats, their eyes immediately drawn to the defendant. In that moment, before a single word of evidence was presented, before the opening statements were delivered, before the facts of the case were even outlined, something troubling was already happening in that jury box. Jury selection had taken 2 days, resulting in a panel that the legal system considered fair and impartial. There was Robert Chen, a 58-year-old accountant who prided himself on being logical and objective. Margaret Sullivan, a 45-year-old teacher who believed in second chances, but also in personal responsibility. James Patterson, a 35-year-old insurance salesman who had strong opinions about law and order. The other 9 jurors represented a cross-section of Chicago society: retirees, young professionals, parents, and students. All had sworn under oath that they could judge this case fairly based solely on the evidence presented. All had assured the court that they had no prejudices that would prevent them from reaching an impartial verdict. But as they looked at Dr. Williams in his orange jumpsuit, sitting in the defendant's chair with his hands cuffed, their minds were already forming conclusions that had nothing to do with evidence or facts. Robert Chen found himself thinking about crime statistics he'd read in the Tribune. Margaret Sullivan clutched her purse a little tighter and wondered if her classroom security measures were adequate. James Patterson looked at the defendant and saw confirmation of everything he'd believed about the breakdown of society and personal responsibility. None of them were consciously racist. They would have been offended by the suggestion that their judgments were based on anything other than rational assessment. But implicit bias doesn't require conscious intent. It operates in the shadows of the mind, shaping perceptions before reason has a chance to intervene. The fact that this man was sitting in a defendant's chair meant he had probably done something wrong. The fact that he was being charged with assault meant he was likely dangerous. And the fact that he fit certain visual stereotypes that had been reinforced by decades of media representation and social conditioning meant that to many of the jurors, his guilt seemed more probable than his innocence. What the jury didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom except his defense attorney knew, was that Dr. Marcus Williams was one of the most celebrated pediatric cardiothoracic surgeons in the United States. For 15 years, he had been the head of pediatric cardiac surgery at Children's Memorial Hospital, where he had performed over 2,000 life-saving operations on children with complex heart defects. Dr. Williams hadn't grown up privileged. Born in the south side of Chicago to a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, he had earned his way through medical school with a combination of academic scholarships, student loans, and sheer determination. His mother had died of a heart attack during his residency, a heart attack that might have been prevented if she'd had access to better health care, and Marcus had dedicated his career to ensuring that no child would die from a treatable heart condition due to lack of resources. He had pioneered surgical techniques that were now taught in medical schools worldwide. He had performed pro bono surgeries for families who couldn't afford care, often working 16-hour days to accommodate both paying and charity cases. He had traveled to developing countries with Doctors Without Borders, performing life-saving surgeries in makeshift operating rooms with minimal equipment. The walls of his office were covered with photos from grateful families, drawings from young patients, and certificates of appreciation from medical organizations around the world. He had been featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of America's best doctors. He had received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions to pediatric medicine. He had saved the lives of over 500 children who had been deemed inoperable by other surgeons. But none of that mattered in this courtroom, because none of that was visible to the jury. All they could see was a black man in an orange jumpsuit, accused of violence, fitting their preconceived notions of who commits crimes and who doesn't. The events that had led Dr. Williams to this courtroom had begun on a rainy Tuesday evening 3 weeks prior. He had just completed a 14-hour surgery on a 6-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez, whose parents had brought her to Children's Memorial as a last resort after 3 other hospitals had declared her condition inoperable. The surgery had been successful, but Dr. Williams was exhausted as he walked to his car in the hospital parking lot. That's when he witnessed something that would change his life forever. A man named Bradley Mitchell, a 35-year-old pharmaceutical sales representative, was in the parking lot screaming at a Hispanic woman named Maria Santos. Maria was trying to get her 8-year-old son David into their car, but Bradley was blocking their path, shouting racial slurs and telling them to go back where you came from. The situation escalated when Bradley grabbed David roughly by the arm, causing the child to cry out in pain. David had been born with a complex heart defect that Dr. Williams had surgically repaired 2 years earlier. The boy's chest still bore the surgical scars, and his heart was still fragile from the multiple procedures he'd undergone. Dr. Williams approached the situation intending to de-escalate it peacefully. He identified himself as a doctor, asked Bradley to calm down, and tried to explain that the child had a serious medical condition that made rough handling dangerous. Bradley's response was to shove Dr. Williams and unleash a torrent of racial epithets that would have made a KKK member blush. When Bradley then grabbed David again, this time by the throat, Dr. Williams's medical training and parental instincts took over. What happened next lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Dr. Williams pushed Bradley away from the child, and when Bradley swung at him, Dr. Williams defended himself. Bradley fell, hit his head on the pavement, and suffered a concussion and broken nose. Security cameras captured the entire incident, but the police report focused only on the final 30 seconds, the part where a black man had struck a white man, sending him to the hospital. The context, the racial slurs, the threat to a medically fragile child, none of that made it into the official narrative. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Kim stood to deliver her opening statement with the confidence of someone who had prosecuted hundreds of assault cases. To her, this was straightforward. A man had committed violence against another man, and regardless of any alleged provocation, violence was not an acceptable response in a civilized society. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, the facts of this case are simple. On the evening of March 15th, the defendant, Marcus Williams, attacked Bradley Mitchell in the parking lot of Children's Memorial Hospital, causing serious injuries that required emergency medical treatment. She painted a picture of unprovoked violence, of a dangerous individual who had chosen assault over peaceful resolution. She acknowledged that there had been some kind of disagreement between the defendant and the victim, but emphasized that nothing justified the level of violence that had been used. Defense attorney Jennifer Lopez faced an uphill battle. She knew that her client was innocent of the charges as they had been framed, but she also knew that implicit bias would make it difficult for the jury to see past Dr. Williams's appearance and the fact that he was sitting in the defendant's chair. Members of the jury, she began, by the end of this trial, you will learn that this case is not about what happened in that parking lot. It's about who Marcus Williams really is, and why a man with no history of violence found himself in a situation where he had to choose between watching a child be hurt or taking action to protect that child. But as she spoke, she could see it in the jurors' faces, the subtle signs that they had already reached their conclusions. The way Robert Chen's arms were crossed defensively, the way Margaret Sullivan avoided making eye contact with Dr. Williams, the way James Patterson was taking notes that seemed more focused on confirming his pre-existing beliefs than on recording actual facts. The prosecution's case was methodical and superficially compelling. They called Bradley Mitchell to the stand, where he testified that he had been having a minor disagreement with a Hispanic woman when Dr. Williams had violently attacked him without provocation. Bradley was a compelling witness, well-dressed, articulate, and bearing visible injuries that supported his claims. He denied using racial slurs, denied grabbing the child, and painted himself as the victim of an unprovoked assault by a dangerous individual. The prosecution showed surveillance footage of the incident, but only the final 30 seconds, the part where Dr. Williams pushed Bradley and then struck him. Without context, it looked like clear-cut assault. They called the responding police officers, who testified about finding Bradley injured and bleeding while Dr. Williams stood over him. They presented medical records showing Bradley's injuries, concussion, broken nose, facial lacerations. The jury watched this evidence with growing conviction. Here was clear proof that the defendant had committed a violent crime against an innocent victim. The fact that Dr. Williams was a large black man attacking a smaller white man only reinforced their unconscious biases about who commits violence and who doesn't. What the prosecution didn't mention was Bradley Mitchell's history of similar incidents. They didn't talk about the 3 previous complaints filed against him for harassing Hispanic families at the hospital. They didn't mention that he had been banned from 2 other medical facilities for similar behavior. Most crucially, they didn't show the complete surveillance footage, the 5 minutes that preceded the physical altercation, showing Bradley's racist verbal assault and his grabbing of young David Santos. When it came time for the defense to present their case, Jennifer Lopez knew she had to do more than just challenge the prosecution's evidence. She had to fundamentally change how the jury saw her client. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I want you to meet the real Marcus Williams." She started by calling character witnesses, not just colleagues, but families whose children Dr. Williams had saved. One after another, parents took the stand to describe how Dr. Williams had given their children life when other doctors had offered only palliative care. Maria Santos, the mother of David, testified about Dr. Williams' 2 previous surgeries on her son, explaining how the doctor had never charged them despite their lack of insurance, and how he had personally followed up on David's care for 2 years. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the chief of pediatric medicine at Children's Memorial Hospital. Dr. Chen was Robert Chen's daughter, a fact that hadn't come up during jury selection, but that would prove crucial to the trial's outcome. Dr. Williams, she testified, is not just one of the finest surgeons I've ever worked with. He's one of the finest human beings I've ever known. In 15 years, I have never seen him lose his temper, raise his voice, or respond to stress with anything other than calm professionalism. She described Dr. Williams's reputation in the medical community, his charitable work, his research contributions. She explained that on the night in question, he had just completed a 14-hour surgery saving a child's life, his second life-saving surgery that week. Dr. Williams doesn't see violence as a solution to problems, she testified. If he used force that night, it was because he believed a child was in immediate danger. The turning point came when Jennifer Lopez was granted permission to show the complete surveillance footage. As the jury watched the full 5 minutes of the incident, they saw a completely different story unfold. They saw Bradley Mitchell corner Maria Santos and her son, blocking their path to their car. They heard his racial slurs, captured clearly by the parking lot's audio system. They watched him grab 8-year-old David roughly by the arm, causing the child to cry out in fear and pain. They saw Dr. Williams approach peacefully, attempting to de-escalate the situation. They heard him identify himself as a doctor and explain that the child had a medical condition. They watched Bradley shove Dr. Williams and unleash a torrent of racial abuse. Most critically, They saw the moment when Bradley grabbed David by the throat, a moment when a medically fragile child with a repaired heart was in genuine physical danger. The footage showed Dr. Williams hesitating, clearly struggling with the decision of whether to intervene physically. It showed him looking around for security or police, finding none. And it showed the moment when his medical oath, "First, do no harm," translated into protecting a vulnerable child from someone who was causing him harm. The actual physical altercation lasted less than 30 seconds. Dr. Williams pushed Bradley away from David, and when Bradley swung at him, Dr. Williams defended himself with minimal force. Bradley's injuries were the result of his fall, not from any excessive violence by Dr. Williams. As the complete evidence unfolded, something remarkable happened in the jury box. The same people who had looked at Dr. Williams with suspicion and fear began to see him differently. Robert Chen, the accountant, found himself thinking about his daughter Elizabeth's testimony. If his own daughter, a doctor he trusted implicitly, vouched for this man's character, perhaps his initial impressions had been wrong. Margaret Sullivan, the teacher, began to imagine what she would want someone to do if one of her students was being grabbed by the throat by an adult screaming racial slurs. Would she want bystanders to call security and wait, or would she want someone to act immediately to protect a vulnerable child? James Patterson, who had been so convinced of Dr. Williams' guilt, found himself researching the doctor's background on his phone during breaks. The man he had prejudged as a dangerous criminal was featured on hospital websites as a miracle worker, praised by medical organizations around the world for his contributions to saving children's lives. The other jurors were experiencing similar transformations. As they learned about Dr. Williams' true identity and the real circumstances of the incident, their perceptions shifted from seeing a dangerous criminal to seeing a hero who had been forced into an impossible situation. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before reaching their verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman, Robert Chen, stood to deliver their decision. "We find the defendant, Dr. Marcus Williams, not guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted in applause from the many families whose children Dr. Williams had saved and who had come to support him during the trial. Maria Santos was crying, holding her son David, grateful that the man who had saved her child's life twice, once through surgery, once through intervention, had been vindicated. But perhaps the most significant moment came after the trial, when several jury members approached Dr. Williams to apologize for their initial assumptions. Robert Chen, in particular, was visibly emotional as he shook the doctor's hand. "I'm ashamed to admit this," Chen said, "but when I first saw you in that defendant's chair, I had already decided you were probably guilty. It took learning who you really are to realize how wrong I was. I'm sorry for that, and I'm grateful for what you've done for children like my grandson, who had heart surgery at Children's Memorial last year." The case became a landmark in discussions about implicit bias in the justice system. The Chicago Bar Association used it as a training example for attorneys about the importance of presenting complete evidence and challenging juror assumptions. 6 months after the trial, Dr. Marcus Williams returned to his work at Children's Memorial Hospital. But his experience in the justice system had changed him. He began speaking at law schools and judicial conferences about implicit bias and the danger of judging individuals based on appearance rather than character. That jury wasn't evil, he would tell audiences. They were normal people who had been conditioned by society to see danger where there was actually heroism. The problem isn't individual prejudice, it's systemic conditioning that makes good people reach bad conclusions. He established the Marcus Williams Foundation for Justice in Medicine, which provides legal defense for healthcare workers who face charges for acting to protect patients in emergency situations. The foundation also conducts research on how implicit bias affects medical care and criminal justice. Bradley Mitchell was eventually charged with child endangerment and hate crimes related to his actions in the parking lot. He was also sued by Maria Santos for his assault on her son. The incident cost him his job and his reputation in the pharmaceutical industry. Most importantly, the case led to policy changes at Children's Memorial Hospital. Security protocols were improved to better protect families from harassment. Staff received training on recognizing and intervening in bias-motivated incidents, and the hospital implemented a zero-tolerance policy for racist behavior on their premises. Dr. Williams continued his medical practice, saving hundreds more children in the years that followed. But he never forgot the lesson of that courtroom, that sometimes the people who seem most different from us are actually the ones we should most admire. Prejudice, he often said, is just fear based on incomplete information. The cure for prejudice isn't anger or resentment, it's education and understanding. When people learn the truth about who you really are, most of them will surprise you with their capacity for growth and change. The 12 jurors who had initially prejudged Dr. Williams became some of his strongest advocates, spreading his story throughout their communities and helping to change minds about the dangers of implicit bias in the justice system. And young David Santos grew up healthy and strong, his repaired heart beating steadily, thanks to the surgical skill and protective courage of the man who had saved his life twice in very different ways. The end. If this story opened your eyes to the dangers of implicit bias and the importance of looking beyond appearances, hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful stories about justice, prejudice, and the heroes hidden in plain sight. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever judged someone before knowing their full story?